All right. Thank you all for coming out today. Thank you all for having me here. I'm so excited to be speaking. Let's get started. I want to start with a simple question. This, of course, needs to be turned on. Aha. Nope. Simple question. Now, so I should explain. I'm using this really cool new slide bundler for my talk. Really powerful, but it just means that I have to recompile every time I change slides. You won't even notice it, I promise. OK. So first question. Who here has used Webpack? Show of hands. Literally everyone. It is an essential piece of web development today. Now, second question. Just give it a second. Second question. Who here has ever seen one of these? Right, OK. That's great. This is, if you don't know, this is a bundle analysis. So this is taking a look at what's in your Webpack bundles. And if you haven't run one of these, one of the first times you do, it'll probably look a lot more like this, where it's really common for different bundles to just have like weird things going on. So this was a real bundle analysis that was shared of a real production site where React and Material were just in every bundle, duplicated 40 times over, sent to the user 40 times over, and just was happening. No one really noticed. So it's really easy for this to happen with Webpack unless you're really conscious about doing one of these analyses. Now, this is feeling a little familiar. Does this feel familiar to anyone else? Is that Create React app? Is that you? That is you. How'd you get in my talk? Huh. And this actually brings up, while I was doing this dumb bit, I actually started thinking about how much time I spend waiting for that screen. And so I actually want to get some numbers. I got all the last apps that I've worked on, and I timed them. And this is what I saw. And this wasn't a surprise, right? I'd been working on these over the course of years, but to actually see it laid out like there, basically the worst offender was taking about a minute to start up and taking about 11 seconds to recompile every change. And that's a lot of time added up over years, right? And so one of the things I want to talk about, because you've seen the bad news, right? This isn't to talk about how to use Webpack better. This is actually a talk about how not to use Webpack. Or rather, it's a talk about why we use bundlers at all and what that's costing us. So Pika is a project that I work on to basically reimagine what JavaScript could look like today and to help move the JavaScript ecosystem forward. And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. We want to take this graph and see if we could do something better. And one of the tools today I'm going to show you takes this and brings it here. Our goal is at start time less than 1 second and recompilation at less than 300 milliseconds. So I'm going to show you that tool again a little bit later. But first, we need to answer that fundamental question. Why do we need bundlers today? Why do we need Webpack? And another question, why did I call this talk Reimagining the Registry if all I'm going to do is talk about bundlers for 20 minutes? The answer to both questions is NPM. NPM is the reason that we need bundlers today. And to really go back and answer that question, we have to go back 10 years, OK? Who was doing web development 10 years ago? I was just getting started out. It was chaos compared to today. You had to just put these script tags everywhere. Your dependencies, if you had to get them in the right order, one would depend on another implicitly. So God forbid they were in the wrong order. And if you were smart, you would do something a little smarter with your source code at least. So this is AMD. This was a module system that was pretty popular back then. It allowed you to define your imports and define your exports in a user-land module system. So you'd ship this to the browser. And this worked for the time because bundling at the time was really just string concatenation. We'd really just take these files, these smaller JavaScript files, and then combine them into one bigger JavaScript file. And then this would all kind of work. It could define its imports, define its exports. Now, at the same time, Node is getting started. And they decided to go with something else called Server.js, which was later renamed to CommonJS. Now, this should feel very familiar. This is what Node's module system looks like today. It allows you to define your imports, define your exports, but in a little bit more of a user-friendly way, right? You don't need to worry about asynchronous loading. You just have this require call. It's pretty nice. It's a little more user-friendly, a little less boilerplate. Now, this would never run in the browser on its own, right? What would the browser even do when it saw require? It would just block the app while it loaded that file and any of its dependencies, and how would it look things up? They'd all be different requests. So this was never meant to run in the browser on purpose. And for whatever reason, these two groups couldn't really come together on one module system, so you ended up with two different module systems that were popular at the time. One for Node and one for the web. Now, looking back, this was never really going to last, right? Like, the opportunity is too great. You have two groups of people doing the same development in the same language, but just they can't use each other's code. And so it was the Node people that finally figured this out with a tool called Browserify. If anyone uses this was one of like the first bundlers that would look at your Node code. Instead of just like simple string concatenation, it would actually follow your imports to build your dependency graph, and then build that all together into one JavaScript file that would stitch up all the different imports. So instead of worrying about asynchronous loading, everything was in one file. It would all just load and run. And Browserify and Webpack really figured this out in a way that allowed this one module system to work on both Node and the web. So with Browserify and then later Webpack, everyone was able to come under one tent, do a lot of development together, tons of efficiency. This was a good thing. But I want to highlight one concession that came out of this that a lot of people, I at least certainly, didn't realize at the time. And it's really important. The web decided to use tooling to access NPM. So the web added a bundler. And we'd already been doing production optimization, bundling into single files. But we added it to dev time, too, now. So now it's an essential required piece of working with NPM. Node never had to make this concession, right? They welcomed web developers into their ecosystem. So the expectation there is that an NPM package will run as installed, as written, as published on Node without tooling. The web then has to go and do whatever it takes to make that work for them. So this is a really important dynamic that I just want to highlight because we're going to get back to it in a second. I want you to keep it in mind for the next section. Now, years later, JavaScript's taking off, Node and NPM are doing well, and the community finally gets together and ratifies a native module syntax. So it has the user-friendliness of require and CommonJS with your imports there. But it's native, so the browser can actually understand it and do some really cool things with asynchronous loading. So it works. The goal is to work in both environments. And because it's really easy to analyze, it's really explicit about what it's doing, bundlers are also really good at optimizing this code. So they can do things like tree shaking and things that will just make this a little bit more efficient when you ship it to production in a web app. Smaller code bundles. Now, there's one notable exception to this, right? Because this was a few years ago. Modern browsers are using this now. Webpack, or rather Rollup, Babel, TypeScript. This is probably the syntax that you're writing today in your apps. They're all using this pretty heavily. The one holdout is Node. It's a really hard problem to move an ecosystem across module systems. And they've tried a lot of different things, but they're still primarily on CommonJS. So they're doing hard work, but it's been a really tough road to get there. And they're finally making really good progress. But for the time being, Node is still on CommonJS. Everyone else is either in process of moving or has moved already to ESM. And this is where that dynamic comes back into play, where packages are expected on NPM to run as written for Node, which means that you as a package author need to write CommonJS and publish CommonJS if anyone in the Node community is going to use it. And so everyone on the web has to take this and do something with it to make it run on the web. So what you end up there is NPM is still primarily on CommonJS and doesn't get a lot of the beneficial things that ESM can give you for optimization and just this more modern native syntax. Now, there are workarounds. Rollup started doing this, and a lot of people have caught on, which is a module entry point in your package JSON. So if you as a package author, right, you need to support Node, so you need to support CommonJS, but you can go and do a few extra steps to support ESM. So you can build a second distribution of your package, include a module entry point to it, and if that's ESM, your bundler will recognize it, and you'll get all those optimization benefits. It works. It's out there. About 7% of packages that we've seen use this. And 7% of a million is still a lot of packages, but it's far from being the standard. It's far from being as supported, blessed by NPM or anything like that. It's an additional thing you have to go out and do. So this is where Pika kind of came on the scene. It started as a way to find these module modern packages that would optimize better and were generally just a little more modern for a web user. And what it was just a search on NPM. So it was like a nice modern filter for web developers on NPM. And if you haven't used this, you should really check it out. It is not as a biased person who built this, although I did build it, but it is a really useful tool for finding just like modern web packages. And it has a few really helpful kind of helper things for the packages that you're looking for. So it'll tell you if they have TypeScript definitions bundled in them. So if you're using TypeScript, it's just like a nice signal to know that it has that. It has a little size indicator, so it'll tell you how heavy this will be when it's added at the end of the day to your web bundle. So it's like NPM search for web developers. It's really cool. So it's 2019. We have ESM. We have a way to publish it on the registry. We're writing it in our source code. Do we still need bundlers? And the answer is yes. Now, that's really sad to me. And it's for three main reasons that we still need bundlers. The first is that just because a package is ESM doesn't mean its dependencies are also ESM. And if any common JS gets into your web app and you ship it to the browser, the whole thing just dies. The second thing is bad imports. So importing by package name and by partial import path, those are really helpful, kind of just nice little shortcuts that we can take, but they were never included in the spec and in the browser. So browsers don't support them. It just doesn't work in the browser. And packages are doing this all the time. Looking up by package name is a really convenient thing to do. And the third is just there's a lot of nodisms out there in the NPM ecosystem. So a lot of these ESM packages are still built for bundlers primarily. So bundlers, one thing that they do really well is because remember, they were added to make NPM work in the web. So what they did was not only just bring all your files into one big file, but they also polyfilled or shimmed a lot of node-isms, so node built-in modules or touching the process global. And so a lot of packages on NPM that are built as ESM are still doing those things because bundlers take care of it. They don't even know that it wouldn't run in the browser. So this gets us to that tool I teased at the beginning, which is one of the things we're working on at Pika, which is trying to ask, we still have this whole decade of web development since bundlers were first kind of introduced in that way. Can we take some of the progress that we've made in the ecosystem and as developers and in the language itself, and can we reimagine what this flow could look like, what bundling could look like today? And so for the rest of this talk, I want to show you this tool that we built called Picoweb. It's a way to run NPM packages in the browser, no Webpack, no bundler required. And while it's true that you can't run these directly off of NPM, some you can, but most packages you can't run directly off of NPM in the browser. What this tool does is it rescopes bundling to solve those three problems that were mentioned. Instead of sending your entire application through a big bundle process with all the complex plugins and toolings, it just scopes it to the three problems that still need solving today in 2019. So what does that look like in practice? Well, for one, Picoweb only runs when your dependencies change. And when that happens, it takes a look at your dependencies, it scans it for any packages with that module entry point, right, ESM support, and then it installs them as web-ready JavaScript modules. So if there's any common JS anywhere that's relied on one of those packages, it pulls it up into that file so you don't have to worry about it. If there's any partial imports, it resolves those. And if there's any nodisms, it tries to take care of as many as it can. And so by rescoping bundling, just to solve those problems, what you end up with are JavaScript packages that run in the web off of NPM, which is really cool. You don't need this whole tool chain. You can just do that. It lets you write modern ESM source, and then we take care of the rest, basically. Now, what this looks like in practice for your source code is that you point to these files directly, right? They run in the web, so you just point to them directly with an import that the browser will understand. So what that means is they live at this web module's location, and it means that you'll never end up with something like this, where you have dependencies kind of scattered and duplicated for efficiency, but they all exist in one place by default. The other nice thing about that is that then there's no giant vendor bundle to worry about either. When one of them updates, that's the only one that needs to be refetched by the user. So again, each one is isolated. They only need to be refetched when they change, which for a lot of dependencies, they don't actually change that much. Now, I mentioned that convenience of importing by package name, and I like that myself. Everyone is pretty happy with that. One thing to kind of clarify here is that using a tool like this, going unbundled, doesn't mean that you don't have to use a build step, right? A lot of the excitement in the space is about the fact that I don't need a build step anymore. I can just write good source code, point it to these good packages, and then ship that to the user. And that's really exciting. But if you use Babel or TypeScript, you can still use this new structure to not have to do so much work per iteration. And so we ship a really easy Babel plugin that just does this rewriting for you. So you can keep writing the same node path imports that you've been using, or package imports. And so again, you don't need to use a build step. And what this ends up looking like is, if you don't use a build step, it's really fast, right? It basically takes as long as your static asset server takes to start up. But you can still use TypeScript or Babel or any tool on your source directory. And that's just as fast as they allow that to work. So TypeScript has a really cool incremental mode where it'll basically just pick up where you left off. Babel is the one that we're still working on, so they don't have any sorts of caching. So when you run watch on a directory, it'll run through all your files. So we're not there yet for large projects, but certainly for small projects. So this is really cool, right? This totally changes how you do web development by reimagining what bundling needs to be in 2019. For the first time in almost a decade, you don't need a bundler. You have the choice to choose this thing that we've all needed for 10 years. You have a chance to choose if you want that or not. And just like a build process, right? You can choose to use a bundler if you want to. If you see this doc, you're like, you know what, this sounds kind of crazy. I'm good. I've done my Webpack time. I've put in my time. I know it now. I'm feeling comfortable. That's fine. Keep doing that. That's awesome. Good. More power to you. And if you're worried about maybe performance of what unbundled means, which I don't have enough time to get into, it could be its own talk. Feel free to use a bundler as a production-only optimization, kind of going back to what we did all those years ago, where it's this thing that you do in production to speed up the flow for users while still letting you have a really quick iteration cycle. So it's all about just getting rid of this requirement that we've had for so long of this really complex tool chain. And I want to end on just talking about what this means, right? And on this piece that Chris Coyer wrote. Sounds like a few people have maybe read this. What this piece was getting at was Chris saw a divide in the community. And he went out and through interviews, talked to different front-end developers about what they saw as kind of the way that the community was working. And what he documented was this. I'm going to use your reading of this to take a drink. He saw one group of developers who were primarily focused on JavaScript, and another group that was basically just everyone else. And you don't have to look too far to find a culprit for this, right? CSS and HTML, they haven't really changed that much over the last 10 years, but JavaScript has changed tremendously over the last decade, right? We're so far from what we were doing 10 years ago when it comes to JavaScript. And there's even a term for this, right? JavaScript fatigue. It's the exhaustion people feel trying to keep up with all the different tools and plugins and frameworks and libraries. It can be exhausting, right? And this isn't just anecdotal. NPM actually backed this up with some data from their yearly developer survey. They said that all survey respondents, that's their word, all survey respondents would like to see less tooling, less configuration required to get started, and better documentation of all these tools. And so you bring these two problems together and view them together, and what you see is an entire group of developers being alienated by how complex and how much work and how much exhaustion comes from working with JavaScript. And what can we do to fix this that isn't just another tool on top of another tool on top of another tool? How can we simplify what we've built up, which has been incredibly powerful, but how can we simplify it back to something that's less exhausting and less just complex, and get rid of things that we no longer need 10 years in the future, and just rescope tooling to where it's needed today. So that's what Pika is all about. I hope these tools are something that you can use today. I hope you find something useful in this and getting back that choice of whether you want to bundle or not. And if you want to come help, Pika is open source. Jump in. It's really exciting. There's a ton of excitement in the space of unbundled and unbuilt and what that all means. So I'd really encourage you all to check it out. And thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so first question here. Does Pika have a CLI client for search?
For search, no, it does not.
Okay.
That's a really good idea.
Okay.
But it's primarily the website right now.
Okay. Gotcha. All right. So on that vein of topics, do you have a wish list for new features you could ship tomorrow if you could snap your fingers?
That's a great question. I do, and I'm trying to think of what that would look like. So one thing that I'm really interested in, and I didn't actually get to talk about this in the talk, but one of the things we just launched last week, maybe you saw it, was Pikacdn. And it's a CDN of all these, it's basically a culmination of all these things together. It's every package that we have indexed on the site, run through Picoweb to basically give you a web-ready package that's hosted. So it's like hosted Picoweb. It's really easy to, basically it's like if any of this tooling part of this seems too complicated, like just feel free to get started and pull something directly from the CDN, use it in a code pen, on Glitch, in your own site. I want to see how we can make that a little more connected to the dev experience, where there's another tool that we built that's more targeted at package creators that helps you ship modern JavaScript. How could we use that to maybe power what the CDN deploys so that that could be a little more modern, a little more faster, a little more optimized? So kind of connecting those, we've been focused on the developer, the consumer, and the developer, the package creator, and I want to see if we can bring those together.
All right, great. Let's look at some more questions here, see if we get any questions on Twitter. Okay, so another question I have here. What does an ideal web bundle ecosystem look like to you?
A web bundle ecosystem? Mm-hmm. So I think what gets me most excited about this is the idea, and it goes back to that kind of like alienating anyone getting started, or someone who maybe isn't as experienced with JavaScript. The idea that you don't need these complex tools to get started. So Pika has been going for about 8 months now, the website. That's all unbundled, all built. I haven't had to touch Webpack yet, which has been really nice for just quick iteration, but I'm sure there'll be a day where I want to do something, and maybe I do need to reach for a bundler. Maybe the site gets too big, or maybe there's some reason where even just for production optimization reasons, I want to do some smart bundling. I didn't have to make that choice day one. I'm able to kind of push that out. So especially if that's a really intimidating choice to make, the idea of just don't touch it then, And when you get to that point, when that makes sense for you, your company, your project, then you can take that time. Mm-hmm. So that's, I don't see bundlers going away. I don't see one bundles not making sense, but it's more of a reframing of you don't need to do development with them, so to speak.
Okay, gotcha. All right, so what's the performance of unbundled versus unbundled? Yeah,
that could be its own talk. It depends is kind of the answer. It really depends. So it's really interesting if you ever want to look into this. It changes what you need to think about. Because you get a lot of really good caching by just having a lot of smaller files, and HTTP2 is a way for the browser to load these files in parallel without too much of a performance hit, as long as they're in parallel. What you get bitten by is long chains of dependencies. So what you really need to worry about is what is your longest chain from start of the page load down to the lowest dependency in your tree. That's what becomes much more of an issue. And then how do you mitigate that? You can reach for a bundler. You could also put some prefetch tags. So if you know that one of those lower dependencies, like a CSS library, is always going to be used no matter what, you can just put a prefetch tag somewhere on the page. And then it's kind of like a shortcut into that tree where now, while you're loading the top of the tree, you kind of start in the middle too, and they both do one of these. So it's really, it's a different set of problems. And it's really interesting on how do you solve those.
So what, in terms of the workload and things that you have to do and your wish list, if someone were to jump into your project today, what do you think that you would need the most help with?
Right now, a lot of documentation is missing, which is both, it's probably harder to jump in because of that. I've just been working on these things and just, it's only recently taken off. So actually, that would have been a better answer. What do I need to do next? It's definitely document these things and how you can work with them and build on top of them. Which is also hard to then jump into a world without documenting, right? So that's my problem. I got to fix that. But it's all on GitHub. They're all just common repos. You can come into them. There's really cool development going on in Picoweb to see how we can handle common JS packages as well. If we could do something to install those as ESM, some sort of wrapper, probably wouldn't get a lot of the performance, tree shaking fixes, but you would certainly get something that would run. And then the other cool thing that's going on right now is an idea of, one thing you don't get is tree shaking on your dependencies, right? Because we install the whole package. So if we install all of Lodash, for example, that's gonna be a big package. It only needs to be cached once, but still, it's a file with everything in it. The next feature that's really exciting is the idea of, before build, scanning your imports and basically doing the tree shaking as a part of building those new packages. So if the tool can see that your source only needs the add method off of Lodash, then we could install just that add method and get rid of the rest of Lodash that you're not even using. So there's some things going on there that are more implementation details, which are they're just community projects. It's been really cool to see people jump in and work on those.
Cool. Could you just define what tree shaking is?
Yes. And I've used that word way too many times to have not defined it. It is the idea of, actually that was a great example. So if you only use one method off of Lodash, you don't need to bring all of Lodash into your site. You can just, with the proper tooling, the tooling can just take out the rest of it. So it's, tree shaking, I guess, is the idea of like shaking it and getting rid of everything that's not necessary, that's not really, that's how I've always pictured it. I don't know if that's actually official. But the idea that you can get rid of dead code, it's dead code elimination. It's a nice word for dead code elimination, nice term.
Gotcha. Cool. And so you also just said that Pika recently just really took off in terms of like popularity and like folks coming to check it out. What do you think, what happened?
A few things. The first thing we launched was a tool for package creators, so that's naturally a smaller group. Picoweb only came after, and around that time, I mean, in the last 6, 7, 8 months, everyone's been looking at this a bit more. So it's just naturally kind of, I don't know, it's more kind of on everyone's minds as we keep moving down this road of modern JavaScript that we write, and then we keep having to go back for the packages we create or the packages that we consume. I think people are starting to ask more of those questions of why do we do all this, and hopefully this is another look at that.
All right, cool. Well, thank you so much, Fred.
Thank you.
Give him a round of applause.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.